Thank you all for coming. I think I'll speak informally so that we can have a discussion and try to avoid this being a sort of a didactic speech. About 1 month ago, the state Senate did pass an aggressive energy bill. There are 40 state senators, by the way, so each of us represents about 165,000 people. The districts always seem crazy because it's one person, one vote, so we don't neatly we can't allow districts to neatly follow town lines, but I'm happy to say that I represent the complete town of Chelmsford. You guys know that the House situation is a little different. We have 160 state reps, and I remember when Chelmsford had a single state rep, and you had a series of outstanding ones, I might mention. Carol Clevin, followed by Bruce Freeman. But at present, Chelmsford is divided into 4 different directions. So Byrne mentioned the importance of talking to your state representative. That's because the House of Representatives hasn't yet taken up climate in a serious way in this 2-year session that ends in July of 2020. So we're already in its second year. And you've got the ability to influence 4 out of 160 reps. That's actually pretty good, to put an optimistic gloss on the way the districts are drawn. At one level, thinking about this climate issue is pretty simple in terms of what we have to do. And I think the Senate, at one level, tried to be faithful to a rather simple sense of what has to happen next. And that's that you kind of need to do 4 things at once. And if you pull off all 4, we can address this terrible challenge that confronts us. The first thing is to make sure that all the electricity, for example, the electricity that lights this room, is green, right? That's wind, solar, hydroelectricity, a few other less prominent potential sources. If all the electricity generated here comes from clean sources and not from oil, coal, or natural gas, then you've got a green grid, very hard to pull off. We don't have it right now. There's a little app on my phone. Each of us could do this. At this moment, ISO New England, which sort of operates the electric grid for the entire region, can tell us what proportions of our electricity come from different sources at this moment. And I haven't checked in the last several hours, but my guess is we would find that about 35% comes from natural gas. A surprising proportion, probably about 30%, comes from nuclear. A significant amount comes from, a smaller amount comes from hydro. A vanishingly small amount at present comes from renewables. So the grid is not green, but we're trending there. Things are promising. We've got these offshore windmills that you've read about in the newspapers. We've got solar. The potential exists to clean up the system of electricity, and that turns out to be the single most important objective we've got to achieve over the next 20 years, because everything else follows from that. If you've got a green grid, the next challenge, and really it's not next sequentially, these things have to happen simultaneously, is that we've got to run all that green juice through every moving vehicle that we can lay our hands on, every car and every truck. So you green the grid, and then you've got to green automobiles and pickup trucks. There are problems with greening some heavy construction equipment, problems with running earth movers off batteries, but most of the vehicles have got to go green using electricity that itself is green. Now that's challenging, but you can still envision that we could find our way to that end point. Step number 3, after you green the grid and green the rolling stock, you've got to green the building stock. That's about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. Greening the building stock means our houses, which right now are on oil or natural gas for the most part, and our businesses, same thing. Greening the building stock is going to be more difficult than greening the rolling stock, but it's achievable, although it's going to require the ingenuity of everybody in this room. A lot of this stuff is going to be grassroots up. It's not going to be top down. Somehow both have to come together. But you can imagine that getting people off natural gas or oil in Chelmsford, businesses and homes, we're going to have our hands full doing that. It's still doable, though. Step 4, again, all these things have to happen more or less at the same time, is that everything, the rolling stock and the buildings especially, have to be energy tight. So once we generate, once we green the grid, green the cars, and green the buildings, we've got to make sure, because it's going to be very tough to pull this off, that everything is as energy efficient as possible, so that the green energy, once it becomes precious, doesn't just leak out because we've got no insulation in the attic, or because we leave the computer on all night because we have no automated way of turning it off. Energy efficiency becomes critical to making the other 3 steps really successes. But at a high level, that's what we face. Green the grid, green the cars and trucks, green the buildings, and make all of it as energy efficient so that we don't waste any of the precious stuff. The Senate bill addresses the question for Massachusetts: how in Chelmsford and in Lexington and in Lowell and in Lawrence and Cambridge and Boston are we going to make all the electricity clean, use it to drive cars and trucks, use it to heat buildings, and make all of it tight as a drum in terms of energy efficiency. There's a lot of things that one needs to do to make the bill click. And as I dug into this and peeled layers of the onion back one after another, it became clear that the crisis really has, in many ways, crept up on us. I mean, in truth, we've been reading about it for decades, not an unlimited number of years, but about 30 or 40. We had a whack at doing things right in the 80s and blew it for a whole bunch of reasons. We didn't revisit the topic until relatively recently. But it is clear that we have still been caught by surprise, which means the government agencies in Boston that work for you at the state government level aren't really prepared to undertake the greening of the grid, the greening of the rolling stock, and the greening of all the buildings. We've got critical agencies that more or less are comfortable doing what they were doing last year, and last year they were doing pretty much what they were doing 10 years ago. So a large part of this is what Elizabeth Warren would call big structural change. There are tweaks to the agencies that you pay for with your tax dollars just to make sure that they're pulling in the general direction of greening everything and electrifying everything. So part of this is structural change, and then part of it are discrete policies. Here's where the Senate bill begins, with this notion. Bern, I thought, I know you know a lot about this. I know you do, Tom. This idea of net zero by 2050. So how many of you have heard of the net zero objective? And for how many people is it kind of a new idea? Net zero doesn't mean absolute zero. And actually, there's been a lively discussion within the environmental circles and the climate change circles as to whether we should go for absolute no carbon emissions whatsoever in Massachusetts, the country, the world, or whether we should net out the differences. I can tell you today, it's very hard to figure out how Lowell General Hospital or Mass General Hospital would operate in an emergency on battery power alone. Let's say everything was electronic at MGH or at Lowell General. Let's say we had a blackout. Let's say we depleted the electric power that governed all the equipment in the local hospital. Could we absolutely afford to see mission-critical institutions like hospitals entirely dependent on electric power and the batteries that might store the power should the electricity be turned off? Probably we're going to need a little natural gas remaining in the system to keep those hospitals functioning in emergency situations. But those are exceptions rather than the rule. Net zero means fundamentally that in 30 years, which is nothing for those of us who are older, it goes by, it seems, in a blink of an eye. In 30 years, we've got to be only using as much fossil fuel as we can compensate for by our forests and trees sequestering carbon. Trees actually suck this stuff out of the air, store it in its woody pulp. Trees offset some carbon emissions, as we're learning. And that's, in that sense, one could operate with a little bit of pollution offset by woodlands and forests remaining at net zero. So setting the net zero goal is the first point of the Senate bill. Easy to set the goal, though, compared to actually achieving the goal, which is really where things get very complicated. Let's see. Then the next question is, and really this is the fundamental reason that I want to hear from you guys today, how do we motivate people to really getting in 30 years to the point where everyone has an electric car in the driveway? Consider the prices of these things today. And everyone has something called a heat pump rather than an oil furnace or a natural gas furnace in the basement. Basically, this comes down to something as fundamental as taking a look around your neighborhood and asking the question as a thought exercise, how is my neighborhood going to transform itself? What resources do we need? Some of it, the Green New Deal postulates that a lot of it's going to come from the federal government. And in fact, we are going to need a lot of subsidies for people who can't afford these enormous transformations in terms of their personal lives. So yes, the Green New Deal is going to presumably, at some point, harness the federal taxing power to supply lots of subsidies right down to our town. But the grassroots piece is going to be just as important because, as a politician, I basically spend a lot of time talking to people. I walk my dog every morning and I talk to my neighbors. I walk around coffee shops. I go into Boston and talk to those of you who wander by, and I can tell you that there are 100 reasons. Well, there are many reasons why people don't feel comfortable buying electric cars today. My wife is nervous because of New England's icy roads. As it happens, it's very hard to find an electric vehicle that is all-wheel drive. There are lots of reasons why people hesitate, the financial one being so paramount among them. And then consider again your house, your condo, your apartment. The only time you're going to consider possibly replacing your oil furnace is when it runs out. And in the next 30 years, that means, if you're typical, that we're going to have 2, maybe 3 one-week shots at your decision-making, right? Because at some point your oil furnace or gas furnace is going to fail. You might feel that it's an emergency. It might happen in the middle of a cold streak. You've got to heat yourself. You've got to warm your family. You're going to have very little time to make a purchase decision. Imagine the product awareness that we need to achieve. Again, it's achievable. We've seen this happen with consumer products all over the place. But imagine the product awareness we need to achieve in order to get you in that 1 week when you're considering replacing that dead furnace, that you should go with something called a heat pump, an electric heat pump, a piece of technology that most of us have never heard of. So you can begin to see that there's an enormous amount of, public education, but also public mobilization that's going to be involved. The oil companies got us into this mess. They were irresponsible for years past when they should have been coming clean, but we're going to get ourselves out of the mess. So the problem happened nationally and internationally. The solutions, to a surprising degree, are going to be Chelmsford-based, Lexington-based, Carlisle-based, ideally with a lot of financial support from our tax money extended to people who otherwise couldn't undertake this on their own. So we set a goal in the Senate bill of net zero by 2050, but then we say, well, look, we're going to have check-ins every 5 years. We've got to get a public conversation going. How do you do that? Mostly state government's kind of invisible. It's not really accessible to people in Chelmsford every day. How do you get a conversation going so that people start to engage with this stuff? We want frequent check-ins at the state level as we progress toward this net zero by 2050 objective, right? If you've got to achieve checkpoints every 5 years, you begin to have a real conversation. You begin to do the math, which brings me to a third point about the bill. In addition to multiple checkup points, we propose to create a Massachusetts Climate Policy Commission, because I don't think the current institutions of state government are going to bring this information effectively to each of us, right in our neighborhoods, right in our families, effectively enough. State government right now doesn't have the ability to really keep this issue top of mind. I want some sort of independent agency, insulated from politics, comprised of smart folks. A lot of them are going to be from the academic community, I suspect, devoted to the single purpose of telling us whether we're on track to reaching these 2050 objectives and the interim 5-year goals that I mentioned, or not. Some sort of truth teller, because I don't think state government, I don't think the governors are, we have a decent governor right now, though I'm not of his party, but he's been pretty good on these issues that I'm concerned about. But I can tell you this, with the passing of time, politicians are going to be in impossible conflicts of interest, in terms of ideas, I mean. We're going to be charged with executing policies as the situation for a while becomes quite urgent, but then criticizing our own execution and making sure that there's critical feedback that keeps us plugging along and keeps us honest in terms of the numbers. I don't think we're capable of balancing those responsibilities and informing on ourselves so that you know whether we're really doing a decent job or not. So I'm seeking some sort of independent commission to get us there. Structurally, I'll just mention one other thing, just to give you some sense as to how complicated this can be. Every agency is going to have to do its part if we're really going to reach these very ambitious emissions reductions objectives. How many of you have heard of the Department of Public Utilities? That's pretty impressive. As you know, the DPU sets your electric rates and your gas rates, so it affects your bills every month. It is a big deal as an agency, and yet its workings in any on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis are below the radar screen. I started to look at the very complex enabling statutes. The legislature writes these, but typically over the course of decades, directing the DPU to do its work. I wanted to find out what we had told it to do, because I was troubled, as chair of the relevant committee, that the DPU has certain preoccupations but wasn't paying attention to the climate question. Natural gas, we're going to have to be off natural gas pretty much in the next 30 years. The DPU regulates natural gas. I wanted to know whether it was devoting some thinking to how we're going to execute this departure from fossil fuels. I found out after combing through the statutes that we have never, as a legislature, told the DPU what we wanted to do. We had somehow failed to give it a mission statement, which is very conventional for other agencies. We tell other agencies what we expect from them in their creation statutes or enabling statutes. We had neglected to tell the DPU ever, the most important climate-related agency in Massachusetts government, had no mission assignment from us whatsoever. And they had invented their own in the absence of our acting, and they were the conventional ones. They are committed to keeping your rates as low as they can make them within the constraints that New England faces, and they're committed, and have always been committed, to maintaining the grid in terms of its stability. So stability of supply and price. That's what the DPU's been That's what the DPU focuses on today. It doesn't think about the climate issue. Actually, it doesn't even think about safety, and witness what happened in the Merrimack Valley with the natural gas explosions. It does not think about your system being hacked, even though we know that folks would like to take down the grid, foreign powers included, if they could. They don't think about the security of the system. They don't think about the safety of the system. They don't even think about fairness toward folks who don't have a lot of money. And the glaring omission, I decided, was no consideration whatsoever of emissions and climate change. But it's the legislature's failure, not the DPU's. We were responsible for making sure that the agency balanced all these considerations, and we failed to. So the Senate bill gives the DPU its first marching orders ever. And so, and there are many specifics of this kind. I'll mention one other because it will be of interest to some of you in the room. About 12 years ago, we created an entity called the Clean Energy Center to innovate, to work with the private sector, the technology companies in Massachusetts, the folks in academia, and to see if we can invent our way out of some significant portion of this challenge, right? Because Massachusetts consists, it's filled with people who are problem solvers. The Clean Energy Center, created a dozen years ago, has run out of money. In the middle of a climate crisis, it essentially, I should say it's depleting its funds. It's got about 20 months left of operating capital, and then it's broke. That's extraordinary. So the Senate bill, as you might imagine, gives it a new lease on life, gives it a new, an expanded mission, and starts to point the way towards solving its problem, its funding issues. It's not an appropriations bill, but we've highlighted it in the Senate legislation so that annual appropriations can begin to flow. It's shocking in a technology state like ours that the one entity we've got that our wedge into innovation should have no money. It's shocking that our Department of Public Utilities should have no mission statement. And so it goes. I'm reasonably confident, but only to a point, that the House will attach importance to these same sectors and that we'll really get somewhere. But it's really a jump ball at this point. And that's not to criticize the House. I'm embarrassed to say that there's a certain amount of competition that exists between the branches. Sometimes if one branch seizes on a set of issues, the other branch charges in the other direction. We can't really afford that on this one. We've got 5 months to get this bill passed, and I do want to encourage you to talk, because you happen to have a good House delegation, and so I do want to encourage you to talk to them to get something done here. There are 25 additional sections of the Senate bill. I don't think I will go through all 25, but I want to circle back to what I see as the fundamental challenge here, and then ask for your help. If we've got greening the grid, that's a macroeconomic enterprise. That does take place at the level of state governments and state agencies and big business. And we're getting there. We're getting solar and wind slowly into the mix. But the other two, greening the rolling stock, making sure that all the cars and trucks are battery-powered, possibly hydrogen-powered, but battery power for the moment is the option of choice. And then greening the building stock. How are we going to do that in this town and in the town, one town over and the town after that? That's the question that I'm really concerned about. I think a lot of it is going to require grassroots activity. I was talking about Evie Hobbs, who's here from my staff, and the rest of our staff was talking the other day about priorities of mine in the upcoming state budget. The state fiscal year begins on July 1st. So this spring, the House and the Senate will be adopting a budget. And we decided that we've got to find some way of funding local activism, because a lot of it is going to come really from you guys, asking and these questions are being asked, by the way, in your neighboring communities too. how do I get it together to replace my polluting heating system with something cleaner, or the vehicle in my driveway? What would it take for me to change, and then for my neighbor to change? I think that conversation is going to have to take place neighborhood by neighborhood, town by town, with the help possibly of some state funding to nonprofit groups, because it's going to require a lot of problem solving at our level, and it does also entail a massive transformation in terms of what we think about and what we consider as options and what we feel is available to us. I think we're going to solve this, but it's going to be something like what our parents experienced in World War II, right? Our parents are our grandparents. There, the country came together with one common purpose. It took Pearl Harbor, but we came together. Everyone agreed that we faced an existential crisis. The United States itself as an idea hung in the balance, and we managed to problem solve our way out of that, with generous help from people in the rest of the world, I might add. But the U.S. did more than its part. We're going to, once again, have to require that common sense of purpose on this huge challenge before us, and we've got to somehow then translate it into an effective effort street by street. So help me figure out how we can do that. It's nothing that state government can do by itself, but I believe that we're going to come to that sense of common purpose, and I wrote a bill, I think, that will give us the tools once we arrive at the state of awareness I'm talking about to address the problem. Yes, hi. What's that?
The number?
It's S2500. The big one is 2500. There are 3 bills in all. A second one has to do with electric vehicles, and a third actually has to do with kitchen appliances. A lot of your energy is dissipated using regular household products that can or cannot be energy efficient. So we want to make sure that everything from your mixer to your computer to your TV is as energy efficient as possible. So we actually wrote a very complicated bill dealing with that alone. Yes, hi.
Beacon Hill looking at all that, what's going on in Brookline, and what I know the folks in Arlington are working in the same vein this week.
Yes, you know, for new construction, no natural gas hookups. With I might add, and this isn't picked up by the press, with a lot of exceptions. Exceptions, for example, for labs. Labs, R&D facilities are very energy intensive, and once again, for a whole bunch of reasons, might not be able to get off fossil fuels completely, beginning with whatever's constructed next month. But houses and regular business buildings, the idea is no natural gas. So they immediately want to get to this heat pump question, which I've referenced several times. I think that's an example of grassroots activity below the level of state government that's going to address this problem head on. Very tricky to pull off, but Brookline, which is a hive of economic activity with lots of construction, is going right at the issue. Yes, hi.
It's more of a problem area than that, because we tried to put in a geothermal system in a site 2 years ago.
In what town?
Right here in Chelmsford.
Yeah.
Okay. It was an ideal site for it. We couldn't find a qualified installer, and we couldn't find our way through the permitting process to extract heat out of wetlands. Okay.
Yes,
Lots of barriers here. Not just
you're right. There are. Let me talk about. May I talk about carbon pricing in connection with that just a little bit, because it's also part of the Senate bill. How many of you pretty much know what carbon pricing is? So there's kind of a divided sentiment here in the room. Fundamentally, the role that carbon pricing plays is to address a problem of chronic underpricing right now. You know, we're great number crunchers. This is the modern era of big data, or so they tell us. So we can attach pretty accurate numbers to the real cost of our my burning a gallon of gasoline to come up here from Lexington this evening. And of course, the price I pay right now reflects the cost of exploration. Somebody found the petroleum someplace and then took it out of the ground. The cost of the gallon reflects that, refined it, shipped it here, and sold it to me at retail. But the price I paid for that gallon doesn't reflect, well, the emissions impact, right? Those costs are real, but they're socialized. So when we talk about resilience in building seawalls to resist rising ocean levels, we're essentially subsidizing the oil companies and keeping the price of their product low so that we'll consume a whole bunch of it, and attending to the climate impacts through the tax system. Same way with the health, right? Impacts of burning that gallon of gasoline. Lots of asthma, we know, along corridors that are heavily trafficked by automobiles. That's a real cost of an internal combustion engine system. We socialize that too through the insurance that we all purchase, and the product manufacturer doesn't have to worry about that. Carbon pricing simply says, look, we're so good these days at numbers, let's add the health cost and let's add the emissions cost back into the original product. Not so that people won't be able to buy it at all, but so that when they purchase it, they won't be depending on the taxpayer to pick up the expense of those externalities. We'll simply pay for it at the pump. Because we know what people do when prices blip up a little bit, they do use less. People are incredibly price sensitive. I know when we were all debating as a country Obamacare, there was a big issue about whether we should charge co-pays for people's annual physicals. And the research that was done found out that people are amazingly sensitive to paying the $25 or the $35 annually that they might have to expend to pay for their physicals if we attached a copay to it. $25 or $35 a year matters to some people on fixed income, and for some reason operates as a psychological deterrent to others. So the significant numbers of people would let their health go if we attached a price to that physical. We did not. Obamacare says you get your annual physical without a copay. You bring that same reasoning over to the energy sector. If we can truly price, not overprice, but honestly price a gallon of gasoline, we'll all use less. And yet we'll also retain a lot of choice, right? This is a non-coercive way to address the problems of climate change. There are alternatives. You attach the true price, the health and emissions price, to a gallon of gasoline, and people will start to move to electric cars eventually. We won't want to pay that. But listen, but the alternative, if you don't want to do carbon pricing, is to do what countries in Europe are beginning to do, and that's to ban the internal combustion engine altogether, to give up on doing this one individual decision maker at a time in response to an honest pricing scheme. Denmark and Sweden and Norway are saying, you know, as of 2030, people won't be able to purchase internal combustion engine cars at all. We're going to be wrestling with how to get this job done. Carbon pricing is the moderate approach, which leaves you free, as I say, to make your own decisions, but simply to pay the cost of those decisions. There are all kinds of other options that we're going to have to grapple with if carbon pricing doesn't work. Yes, hi.
I think you're on the Energy Committee with co-chair with
Tom,
Golden.
yes.
So we met with Tom Golden, not me alone, but another group. Met with Tom Golden and asked him about climate change, and he didn't believe that we needed to set any goal. He believes in climate, the science of it.
Yeah.
But doesn't believe we need to set any goals. So I just wanted to ask you why you think targets are important, and what is it?
Yeah.
How are they really going to play out? Having targets?
What we need is a disciplined approach. And it's hard for me to imagine our achieving anything that's difficult without first adopting a goal. It's just a matter of human nature, really. I can tell you that I'd like to lose 5 pounds. If I didn't have the goal, I don't think I'd make as much progress. As it is, I'm not making a lot of progress. If I didn't have the goal, I'd really be in trouble. Some of us have goals to, my kids want to buy a house someday. They're saving money because they want to be able to afford a down payment. They have a goal. It's hard to imagine not calibrating your progress toward an endpoint, but managing to achieve it. It's very, very tough. I can tell you that here's what's happened when we've set a goal. We set a goal, for emissions already. It's just that it's more permissible. It's more lenient. The first thing it does is get people talking. The great thing about goals is that we all talk about, well, shucks, do you need them, and what should it be? You want that conversation to happen. If you don't have a debate about goals, you're not going to be able to grade yourself in your progress. So I think Tom is moving on this stuff. I know he's open-minded. He does need to hear from folks, and he welcomes hearing from people. But he and I talk a lot, and I think he's receptive to everything potentially. He'd be the first to tell you that he's a more moderate guy on these topics than I am. The House, unfortunately, I think is more moderate than the Senate as an entire body. But they're good people, and with all due respect to them, I think those of us who feel it's a real issue and that we have to have goals are winning the argument.
I think Representative Golden has heard from some of his constituents that they don't like carbon price gasoline taxes, is how they
Sure.
term them. And if more of us got in touch with Representative Golden and said, we'd really like to see the carbon taxes, implemented.
And I favor, I'd be perfectly happy with a revenue neutral carbon pricing scheme. You know how that works? Imagine if we instituted carbon pricing in this room. Here's how it could work for the entire state. All of us would pay an extra fee representing the health and emissions cost of a gallon of gasoline every time we bought a gallon of gasoline. We would collect all the money, and we would divide it by the number of people in the room. Here's what would happen if you did that. Those of us who used more than our share, more than the average numbers of gallons, would have paid more in this fee than we'd have gotten back in a per capita rebate. But those of you who are relatively green, maybe you don't have to go to a job anymore, or maybe you work close by. For whatever reason, if you use less than the average, you'd get back more in your per capita share than you will have paid, right? So if the entire state of Massachusetts amasses a kitty that consists of carbon fees, and you divide that kitty by the entire population of the state, and you were to rebate back in a check everyone's per capita share, generally people would be held harmless. But here's the amazing thing, and the economists have tested this. We wouldn't take the rebate check and use it to buy more gas again. That's just not the way human beings work. If you charge me more for gas, but you keep everything else in my life pretty much as it was, I'm going to spend less on gas because it's become more expensive. And the money I'm going to save by not having expended it on a fossil fuel, I'm probably going to spend on food or on clothing or on entertainment. So recycling money, we did a very complicated economic study of carbon pricing. It turns out, of course, that we don't produce any natural gas or oil or coal in Massachusetts. So what happens, here's a thought question. What happens if the price of something that you have to import goes up and you find ways over time? Over time, you don't adjust to it immediately, but over time you find ways to avoid spending the additional price of something that you don't make locally. Well, you affect job creation when you buy less of it, but it's job creation in Saskatchewan, or it's job creation in Texas. It's not job creation in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, if you spend less on an import, the money, and we tracked it with the help of economists from MIT and Tufts, the money gets respent on local things. Coffee at a coffee place, clothing from the mall down the street. So spending less on an import, especially an import that pollutes, taking the disposable income and spending it on something else has a net positive job impact. It's not great, but you actually wind up creating jobs in retail in Massachusetts and taking away jobs from Saskatchewan. I'll take that deal. Hi.
I'm just wondering, as you're talking, the years that I have lived, I've seen the amount of recycling that is going into dumps. Where are you gonna put all of the recycling materials that we have to get rid of? And where is that going? Because I know a lot of it's going up to New Hampshire, because they're looking for space up there, and they're cutting down trees. They're making these big holes, they're going by rivers, and they're dumping it all in there, and some of the towns up north are fighting that. And we have won some of the things, but I live in Massachusetts, Chelmsford. But,
Good for you. Well, you're right, you know, and that happens to be based on fossil fuels, right? That's
the
petrochemicals.
houses that are being built are huge, mega houses, with only 2 or 3 people in them, and, you know.
But see, this is a Chelmsford discussion. It's a state discussion too, but you're right. We're a little overhoused, aren't we? And that consumes a lot of materials. These are discussions that every town has to have, and that's what I mean about this being very local. And we're all going to start engaging with this stuff. By the way, I'm the statewide sponsor of bills to ban polystyrene-based styrofoam takeout containers. I'm with you, and it's a climate issue, because the plastics business is a fossil fuel business, a petrochemical business. And if we can manage to consume less and reuse and recycle more, we're actually taking less oil out of the ground too.
I'm thinking of cosmetics and, you know, all sorts of things.
I'm thinking of everybody's oil tanks eventually.
Sure, right.
Everyone has an oil tank in the basement. That's a lot of, where are we putting this? And our old appliances and everything else that you mentioned.
Right, there is this whole question of lifestyle, isn't there?
Well, lifestyle, and where do you put all the old junk?
And yet we've got to find a way of reusing as much of it as we can, and then not making sure that the junk continues to accumulate. I think there are questions about frugality, which used to be a great New England virtue.
Yes.
Hi, I'm sorry, you were going to.
I guess 2 things. I'm probably the only person in the room from Saskatchewan. I wasn't the least bit offended by what you said. And the second thing is I used to be a petroleum research engineer, and making the statement that using less styrofoam is going to result in using less oil is actually not true, because it's a byproduct of oil refining, and there's an endless surplus of it. We could never possibly run out. So saying that we have to use less with endless surplus would actually decrease oil consumption.
Good. I'll do some more research on the styrofoam. Thank you. Yes. Hi.
You talk about the green vehicles, and how would that apply to the individuals in Massachusetts, for one thing? Is it about who's driving on our streets, or who's buying a car in this state? And what about the Amazon vehicles that are around delivering packages that have New Jersey license plates on them? Who is it that's supposed to be driving the green vehicles in
The
Massachusetts?
President of the United States and has an important role to play here because of those New Jersey plates. We did look into this as well, and state government can't regulate interstate commerce. So we can't get at the Amazon trucks. On the other hand, we can get at mass transit, regional transit authority buses, whether it's the Lowell RTA or the MBTA. And so we are mandating that those go green over a period of time, but we are intent on doing that. We couldn't, as it happens, regulate privately owned vehicles who happen to come into Massachusetts. So some of this stuff can happen in Chelmsford, some can happen in Massachusetts, and yes, we probably need the new President of the United States to help us at that level.
You got that right.
Yes.
Can we as a state mandate what kind of cars our people within the state own? Can we say electric cars and that's it?
No, is the short answer. But the United States could, and what we can do, carbon pricing is a gentle way of getting the same thing done. You've probably seen that when the price of gas goes down, and by the way, again, a gallon of gas is very cheap as I speak this week. As the price of gas goes down, the purchase of pickup trucks and larger SUVs ramps up. As the price of gas rises, people again are surprisingly responsive to that, and they begin to think about fuel-efficient vehicles once more. So while we can't ban a gas guzzler, we can, using carbon pricing, make it properly as expensive as it ought to be. And then people, many, not all, but many will gravitate on their own toward the more cost-effective choice.
Now, you mentioned that there's an automotive bill up at the House or the Senate right now.
We passed, again, there are a lot of moving parts to what the Senate did. We, if you can believe it, and this is embarrassing, the pot of money with which we offer subsidies to those who buy electric vehicles had ran out in October. For 4 months, we had no subsidies available, and someone, by the way, a colleague of mine did have a constituent who didn't know about these subsidies and bought during the 4 months in which there were no dollars available. He's out of luck. But we should never have let it run down. So the Senate bill permanently codifies a system of rebates for those who buy electric vehicles. It's not an enormous amount of money, about $2,500, but it'll help. If on the federal level you can pick up $7,000 if 200,000 vehicles of that kind nationwide haven't yet been sold. So the federal subsidy's gone for Teslas. Unfortunately, it's gone for the Chevrolet Bolt, but it's there for the Kia.
But that $7,500 doesn't help a person who's retired who doesn't have any income.
No, that's actually a rebate, so it's on the purchase price, yeah, rather than a tax. It's not a tax credit.
But if you don't have a tax, you don't get the.
Well, that's true.
And that's happened to me this year.
Yes.
With my boat. But anyways, I'd like to talk something else.
Yes.
I like your idea that we have to have grassroots. It's got to start from the individuals. We can't just order it, mandate it. It's not a fascist country. What about public service announcements, ads, TV?
Bingo.
Just plaster the airways with saying how good electric cars are. They're so much cheaper. The ranges have been improved so much. And if you could get gas stations to add a supercharger view, that would actually really seal the deal.
So we need, you're right, PSAs about EVs to be as ubiquitous as Michael Bloomberg for president TV ads.
Exactly.
If he can afford those.
It's like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the tobacco campaign. A whole culture changed. We need to change the culture.
Yes, we do.
But
a
this
massive
meeting,
advertising.
And then a local town meetings like we're having about climate change, that's where we're trying to spread the word.
Okay. I can tell you that another part of the Senate bill mandates that for all new construction, either of multi-unit housing or of parking facilities, that 5% of all parking spaces, that would be 1 per 20, but then it scales right up. So we'll have lots of electronic vehicle chargers in new construction for parking facilities. Because you're absolutely right, there is this charge anxiety, and we need to address it. Another part of this bill, and this is Western Mass legislators doing their jobs, says that for every rest station on the Massachusetts Turnpike, there will be electric vehicle chargers. Because we've got senators coming from the Berkshires bombing down the pike, and there's only a single charger in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, along the entire Massachusetts Turnpike if you have an electric vehicle. So we're trying to address these things.
Is there a cost for those electric chargers? I don't have an electric car. When you plug it in?
Sure. I'm going to have one put in my house, so I can't tell you exactly how much they are, but I believe it's about $1,500. It will cost me about $1,500.
What about the chargers you see out? You said they're.
Sure, but that should be your taxpayer money at work.
This library is 18 cents a kilowatt.
But I mean, so say I have an electric vehicle, I plug it in, do I pay something into the?
It depends.
You have a
It can
card
depend.
with charge points, and you just pay them.
You pay.
Yeah,
It
just
might
the
be
way
all-
you'd use your charge card, right, to pay, these days, to pay a parking meter.
Yes.
Yeah.
You just tap the thing, and it charges your account, and it debits it, and.
Do you have an electric vehicle?
Yeah, both, and I.
Oh, you do? Oh,
charge it
right.
here
Yes.
all the time.
Good for you. Good.
And
Yes.
the rate is cheaper than you pay at home for electricity in Chelmsford.
Yeah.
It's cheaper than gasoline.
Oh,
Oh, yeah,
2 to 3 times cheaper.
but you're paying more.
I just didn't know how that worked.
Yeah, oh, yeah. You
Ma'am?
can just plug it into your house.
So how
It's
do
very
we
slow.
generate the electricity to pay for these electric vehicles?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. We're doubling down. If we get off fossil fuels, off oil, coal, and gas, we have to double down on electricity. And so here's the kind of difficult trade-offs that we're all going to face, right? All of us have NIMBY instincts. Nobody wants even solar panels filling in that beautiful field that we've passed for years as we've driven someplace. We're going to have to do away with natural gas infrastructure to the degree that we can, but we're going to have a lot of electric transmission lines, and they're not going to be able to be underground, most of them, because it's about 4 times more expensive to bury a transmission line, harder to repair those lines. So a lot of them are going to be overhead. We are going to have to do a lot of solar and a lot of wind, and that's going to create some siting controversies that are going to be painful to confront, and we're going to have the transmission, the grid, to transport the power. So this stuff is not going to be cost-free, even in a psychological and aesthetic way. Yeah, hi.
So you've spoken about electrification, and I know that you need a concerned scientists are supporting that. What about hydrogen cars? The Toyotas had the Mirai out there, and California has a lot of stations up and down their state. We have one right over our neighbor in Billerica who makes the fuel cell, Nuerva, that is used only for industrial purposes. You can't fuel a car.
Yeah. I think hydrogen has a role in terms of heavy, I mentioned light-duty trucks. Heavy-duty vehicles could well be hydrogen instead of battery-powered. So the bill that we've written accommodates hydrogen as well as electric battery clean vehicles.
Stations being cited.
Yes,
Unfortunately,
but there are
they're
very
not
few of them.
around.
And at the moment,
Right.
the economics of hydrogen aren't as favorable as the economics even for the lithium-ion battery. But we're trying to accommodate both. The idea is to give Massachusetts innovators their headroom here to see whether hydrogen can come on a little stronger than it has. Hi, yeah.
Got a question about public transportation and how that factors into it. I know a lot of people who would like to take the Lowell station into Boston every day, but it's not reliable and there's not parking. It's
Right.
just, the headache is gigantic. It's
Right
also
on.
not cheaper.
Right.
So is there,
Well, I think there is going to be a major transportation bill, I think unveiled in the House in the next 10 days. I think it's probably going to involve, it probably needs to involve an increase in the gas tax, because none of this stuff is free. But there's no question we've got to improve the Lowell line and really make that serve as a way for people to commute. So that's expensive on a per mile basis. And actually, for what it's worth, as a way of addressing emissions, laying down new track is relatively expensive on a per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent avoided. But we have to do it for congestion reasons too, right? So yes, this is again, we do need a new president, not to wade into presidential politics, but a lot of this can't happen at the level of Chelmsford, Lowell, or even Massachusetts. We do need a massive federal presence. We spent a lot of federal money to create the interstate highway system. We know that story in the 50s and 60s. We propagated highways everywhere and created for a while a real sense. Remember the road trip as sort of representing high adventure, seeing the world by car. We invested billions to make that happen, and now we have to invest billions to reinvent the train. But we've done it before, we can do it again, not cheaply though.
I'd like to know where the bill is that you're supporting, and how soon it would come up for a vote. I mean, what are the next steps in the joint committee and all? Because it's such a good bill, I want to see what is the progress.
Yeah. So it's completely out of the Senate. It passed the Senate by a vote of 36-2. The Republican minority leader of the Massachusetts Senate voted for a bill that contains carbon pricing and all these other things. Pretty amazing. It's in the House. It's in the House Ways and Means Committee quite specifically. The House has to decide to take it up and to put it on the floor for debate. So this talking to the House really is critical. And we have to,
Is that complementary to the House bill, the Roadmap 2050, or are they going to have to blend together to?
So the 2,500, I'm sorry, what bill are you talking about?
3983.
Roadmap 2050.
Which one is that? Is that carbon pricing?
No, 3983, it's the 2050.
Is that the Joan Machino
Yes.
roadmap
Yes.
bill?
Yes.
So the House could act on Joan's bill. That could easily be reconciled with the Senate bill. But it hasn't chosen to do so. So yes, the House would have to get as ambitious as the Senate. Then we could reconcile the two different approaches, I think, readily. I mean, I have the Machino bill, which I read very carefully when I was writing the Senate bill, is a good start. All these bills are, 90% of the bills in the Massachusetts legislature aren't written by legislators. They're written by, and I want to use this word, well, by lobbyists or by advocates, including good advocates. The advocates write them, and they shop them around to legislators and say, would you like to be head sponsor of this bill? My organization will love you if you do. When that works well, as in the case of the Machino bill, Joan didn't write it. She was handed it. I, as a sort of a obsessive-compulsive lawyer type, have read it. And it needs a lot of work at the granular level. And the trouble with, it was written by good environmentalists, but it overreaches. They say, hey, let's go for the moon. Let's really ask for something unreasonable because some legislators sooner or later will bring it back down to earth. So we don't have to be too responsible in the original writing of it. So the Machino bill is good directionally and has all kinds of problems in terms of its details. So that's a problem. So they should just do it. They should just take my Senate bill.
So in the end, when they both agree on this final bill,
Yes.
that's what we will have.
That's right. And so there's something called a conference committee, the House product and the Senate product, and we'll try to harmonize the two. Sometimes that never happens because we run out of time.
Yes.
So I hope the House doesn't go crazy here. I hope they take the ideas from the Senate bill that they like and preserve the wording more or less intact so that we can quickly conference the House and Senate products and still make our July 30th deadline.
But that's a committee of the House that is working on, has that bill.
Yes.
How many people are in that committee?
Effectively one, the Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives.
So if we contact anyone else but him.
Oh, no. He cares about his members. So the way this works, and the reason we should be optimistic, the Senate, to its credit, there are only 40 of us, so it's a kind of a flat organization. It is very collegial. The House is 160. It's much more hierarchical. But the Speaker, Bob DeLeo, is interested in protecting his members and making them look good. So the way to reach the Speaker is by talking to your local representative and saying basically, holy Toledo, you have got to do something. This climate crisis is going to kill us, and if not me, my kids or my grandkids. We have got to do something. Talk to the Speaker and tell him, act, act, act. That's the way you get something done.
So
And that
who
can
should
work.
we say this to?
Your local state representative, whoever he or she may be.
Okay, so James Asiero
He's terrific, so.
and Tom Golden.
Tom, I think Tom is receptive. I'm not giving up on Tom.
Tom
All
Tom's
right.
always happy to meet with people, I know that much.
Yes, he's charming as the devil, too. Yes, sir.
I bumped into a lot of discussion about this. One of my contacts got me a note saying, what are we gonna do about the embedded energy content? You're building windmills, you're building heat pumps, what are they using to build them?
So, but here's the way we deal with that. Thank you. It's an excellent point. Let's take Massachusetts, the jurisdiction for which I'm responsible. Because we have a knowledge-based economy, only about 9% of our emissions are due to industrial processes, making steel, making plastics, making component parts. We do some manufacturing here in the state, but not an enormous amount. So our industrial emissions are very containable, and we can address those. But the electricity that drives the machinery in those Massachusetts manufacturing plants has got to be green. And the process heat has got to be produced by windmills and solar, creating the steam to drive the turbines. We can get there. We're lucky because we don't have a big, heavy manufacturing base to start with.
We gotta deal with this nationally.
And worldwide, yeah.
A lot of people, it's interesting for me because I do a lot of work up at the State House. A lot of people don't understand. You talked about the conference committee. No recorded vote. What goes in there and what goes on there, you'll never know. And I've seen more things like one vote, one voice that
You're right.
we're not getting out of today's meetings.
Yeah. What sort of work do you do in the State House?
I'm retired.
Well, good for you for taking an interest.
So file a few bills.
Good for, well, all of us need to take an interest because the stakes are getting bigger. Sir?
You asked, what can we do from the grassroots up? I think one thing is, if you live in the town where there was an annual meeting, do something there. Now, Westford is going to, this spring at its meeting, a high school student is going to bring in a very simple 3-line resolution. It's a non-binding, and I said, that's a waste of time. But now I'm thinking, no, it gets people talking about it. Now, there's some other steps down the road, a lot, but that at least gets folks talking about it.
I'll tell you, towns in this immediate area are taking up, there's a whole schedule of things you could play with. They are asking whether there should be new natural gas hookups for new construction. It's not just Brookline, it's actually spreading. Concord bought an electric bus, or actually they got an electric bus given to them in a pilot program. It's a school bus. They're starting to learn how you go clean green on school buses so that diesel doesn't come out the tailpipes as kids are waiting at the stop, getting on and off. Be good to green the school bus fleet, expensive at the moment, but early work in Chelmsford, here's what's going to happen in the next 2 years. And here's why you should consider thinking about a sustainability officer. So Concord, Massachusetts has a funded sustainability officer. What does she do? She writes grant proposals because there's a significant amount of state money already for green projects. And I think we are going to see a huge influx, I hope it's in 2021, on the federal side. A sustainability director for any given town applying for federal and state money to help Chelmsford's next municipal building be net zero, something that a lot of adjoining communities are also doing. In other words, building a school with so much solar and with heat pumps, geothermal included, so that it produces as much clean energy as it uses in carbon energy. Municipal buildings are going net zero. Sir?
Just a shameless plug here. Chelmsford does have a sustainability manager.
Oh, she does. Oh, great. Is it full-time?
Yes.
Full-time.
Wow,
Okay.
great.
There's an Energy Conservation Committee that reviews energy conservation efforts within town. There are a few members here of that. Okay.
Oh, that's great to hear. Congratulations. I hope we have some more money to pass out to you in future years.
We try to max it out every year.
What's that?
We try to max that out every year, but the pot's been getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Good, yes. Well, that is great to hear. I mean, Chelmsford, and I know you guys recently also came up with a plastic bag ban
Yes.
in town meeting. This town is doing some very great things. You should feel good about it. But this street by street conversation, this conversation with your neighbors about electric cars and that remains to happen, remains to unfold, doesn't it? Yes.
Did you say only one constituent bought an electric car in a 4-month period?
No, I'm saying that one of my colleagues mentioned, because the constituent complained, that he turned around and wasn't able to get the subsidy. So it was just an anecdote that I heard about. But it is true that in recent months, the purchases of EVs in Massachusetts have not been great. And again, this is something all of us have to talk about. My wife and I we have 2 Subarus. My car is 11 years old. I'm going to buy an EV. We just got 200 volt service in our electrical system so that we can charge. But I can tell you right now, you try to find an electric car on the lot in Massachusetts in February, there are hardly any to be had at all. You certainly aren't going to find it in the color you want. And you're not going to find it in the model you want, even if you've got the right make. So we've got to put those charging stations in, and the bill speaks to that. We've got to subsidize individual purchases, and the bill creates and codifies those subsidies. But we still need word of mouth. We need those PSAs. We need the Bloomberg paid-for ad on electric vehicles.
Last year, I went to a number of kind of like car shows with electric vehicles. And owners would bring them, and people could come up and check them out and get information. And there was a Drive Electric one here, and Tom Golden spoke, and those are very, very helpful, because
Yes,
it allays
good marketing.
people's fears and gives them a lot of knowledge. They said, oh, I didn't know that. You could do that with the electric car. One guy told me, don't charge it fully if you live on a hill, because the regenerative braking, it will have nowhere to go if the battery's totally full.
Oh, interesting. Well, I'm going to remember that.
ECA has a great presentation on electric cars that a guy named Charlie Michelle did out on the West Coast. And I'd like to be able to give that here at our Thursday monthly climate conversation meeting. So if people are interested in electric cars, I can give you, come up to me after, I can give you a card about that, that monthly.
Yeah, that would be useful, yeah.
Yeah.
Sir, you were going to?
Well, I'm as much of a fan of solar and wind as the next guy. I read, and I don't know what to believe in terms of the numbers, that by themselves they aren't going to be enough. So people talk about, we have oil still as a backbone, natural gas as a backbone. We're aiming for those to go down. How do you see even something like nuclear in the next 20 years, 30 years? Is that a lightning rod that people are avoiding? Is it going to be stable state? Is it actually going to increase?
I think it has to be a part of the mix. Seabrook, in other words, is going to be a part of the mix in terms of our electric power. Plymouth closed in 2019, so we only have 2 reactors left in New England, Millstone in Connecticut and Seabrook in New Hampshire. But we don't want those to be prematurely retired, because we would then have our hands full. But I don't need to tell you that constructing new nuclear plants doesn't seem realistic. I've been watching, there's one under construction in the United States of America, down in Georgia, and it's had horrible cost overruns. The builder and the developer haven't been able to bring it in on time. It's a little unclear why it's about 5 years behind, but of course you have to make them very, very safe, needless to say these days. And this one developer of nuclear plant down south has not been able to deliver on time, on budget. So there were high hopes for clean nuclear, relatively speaking, but they haven't been realized.
What is clean coal? Is there any momentum on that, or is that just dead?
No, there's in the Midwest. There's about carbon capture and sequestration. It is possible to burn coal and to capture the particulates and the effluents as it goes up the stack, but it's incredibly expensive. It's not cost competitive with solar and wind. And so those carbon capture and sequestration projects involving coal, which would clean it up, haven't gone as far as you would like to, as far as conceivably some might want to see them.
The subsidies for the electric cars, how is that funded? That money, where does it?
Well, we're going to have to appropriate money. So another reason why you guys are going to have to be active is because while we've legislated $2,500 subsidies for purchases of cars, it has to, and we funded it for 2 years. We found money through the end of 2021. But after that, it's going to be subject to an annual budget appropriation process, and we have to make sure, those of us concerned about this stuff, that the kitty is replenished.
And that's tax money,
But what's that?
tax money.
It's your money, right? It's your money, and we need to write down the cost of these electric vehicles, no question.
Let me get this straight. I've had a Leaf now for 5 years. I have, in fact, leased it all of those 5 years, 2, 3, and now 1. Car cost about $33,000. They aren't cheap. But on the first 2 times, I got $10,000 off, right off the top. Now, if you were going to buy that as a BMW, they do it by having you do it on your taxes. So the kind of car you buy and where you buy depends upon how that works.
So, it's different with the federal and the state. For the state, you send in and you get a $2,500 check. You have to wait for it. But on the federal side, it's a tax credit.
No, you get that check from the state almost within weeks.
Oh, great. I've had some complaints,
Well, maybe
but you think it's pretty good? Yeah, that's good to hear. But the federal piece is a tax credit, right?
No, it can be either way. I'm saying, when I bought the Leaf, they took it off the price.
Wow.
I walked away from that, buying that car for $25,000.
Congratulations. That's
And I
terrific.
went 3 times, okay? Also, on the new Leaf, they now have something that's called an e-brake, so that when you take your foot off the gas pedal, it slows down the car. So we hardly use our brakes at all. Now,
Yes.
the BMW had that from the very start, so it's not new, but.
Yeah.
So
The Hyundais and the
we're
Kias
paying-
have that too. I
we're
tried them out
paying-
myself.
I paid 0 for keeping that car.
Wow.
Except to rotate the tires. Wow. And plus, we are hooked into a solar farm, so that car is being run from the sun.
Nice. Well, that's beautiful.
Here's another question. I think we make our society a little bit fragile if we're all depending on the grid and something goes wrong with it. So I'm wondering, for people who install solar, currently you have to have those electrons go back into the grid. You can't separate them out. If some allotment could be made for in times of outage, that people could harvest those electrons for charging their electric cars.
That's a very, you can detach yourself from the grid, and we want to encourage microgrids as well. It could be that, and this, if hospitals, for example, are effectively self-sufficient. They aren't dependent on the grid because they can't afford to take the risk. So there are these insular microgrids. They need a source of electricity. They need wind or solar. There actually can be microgrids that are fossil fuel based as well, but we prefer to encourage people to move away from those. But yes, if you want to, you'd have to give up net metering credits, which are an important incentive for solar. But if you wanted your solar panels to provide electricity to you and you wanted to detach from the grid, you could do that, but you'd have to give up some of the advantages too.
Can you do both? Could you have your panels to take care of your car, but your house heat still comes from the grid? Can you do both?
You can if you're willing to pay for the electrical setup in your residence.
Yeah, well, once
Ma'am?
done-
I just want.
You said that there's not as much solar or wind, and I was just wondering why there's not that much solar or wind, like, what a.
Yeah, we were talking about that. Well, the good news is that solar and wind constitute a large proportion of the new stuff, that's coming online. But it takes a while for those new contributions to make a significant part of the whole. So today in Massachusetts, again, it's probably up to 10% of the whole, but it's 50% of the new stuff. But we are facing some challenges. I think the Trump administration is sabotaging our efforts to build windmills offshore. The Baker people have been very aggressive. They've managed to sign contracts with Danish companies and even with Shell Oil, which wants to go green. Royal Dutch Shell, I mean. It's actually a European company. So the people who want to build the windmills have contracted to do it, and they've promised to sell the electricity very inexpensively to us consumers. But the Trump people stepped in at the 11th hour and decided that they needed a review up and down the Atlantic coast from Maine to Florida of all the potential for windmills before they would let Massachusetts go first. Massachusetts had done the work to go first, had contracted with the European developers to build the mills. It's a little too convenient that the Trump people decided that on this one issue they would be environmentally extremely protective. There are some fishing issues which are legitimate that you'd want to address, but still this seems a little suspicious. So wind is slowing down, although we've still got high hopes. Solar, and again, all of us are going to have to wrestle with this one. Solar's starting to encounter resistance from environmentalists who are concerned about open space being converted over to solar farms. There is a trade-off there. The trouble is, if you drive down any street in Chelmsford and you ask the question that some environmentalists are posing, you can see the difficulty in the answer. They say, put all the solar on roofs. So as an exercise, I started to count the number of south-facing roofs. You want your roof to face the sun, south-facing for Massachusetts. I started to count the number of south-facing roofs on a recent drive that weren't interrupted by dormers and that were really available as sort of unbroken roof real estate. Shocking how few roofs are situated so that they're south-facing and present unbroken surfaces that can support significant numbers of panels. New England architecture is marvelously diverse, and a lot of it's quite old, and it does not easily present those south-facing surfaces that we need. So it seems as if about 75% of Massachusetts homes aren't suited for solar panels. They face north, they face east, or they face west. That's a problem. Sir?
Musk is supposedly $7.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I said Elon Musk, it's come up with lighter solar panels, more efficient stuff, so maybe evolving.
That's great. Of course, flat roofs, industrial roofs are often flat enough to support panels. Yes, and that's right. So that's, at the moment, once that becomes commercially available at an affordable price, solar panels will give you an additional option. You're right. I think there's a lot of progress here. That's why we want the Clean Energy Center fully funded and operating, take advantage of Massachusetts' ingenuity. Yes, hi.
Hi. Are there any programs afoot to send some of our experts to China and India, the horrid world polluters, to help them? Help us?
Well, you mean as soon as we take care of the coronavirus? India is doing very poorly. China actually is ahead of us. They have a command and control economy, and they are actually greener by far than the Trump administration. So,
What do you mean the Trump administration?
in other words, China is greener than the U.S. on average.
They're the world's worst global polluters.
Well, India they have a huge population, but not per capita. I'm not saying, for example, and it was a good thing, but a mixed blessing. Remember when they undercut the American markets for solar panels and about 10 years ago during the Obama years, put American solar manufacturers out of business? The bad news is they caused a lot of those companies to close. The rest of the news is China supplies the world with cheap solar panels that many of us now have on our roofs. So there's an instance where globalism had a nasty side, but a positive side as well. But the Chinese are putting us to shame in terms of solar and in terms of electric vehicles. And that's troubling to me. I'm a competitive American. I want to see us leading the way. Well, sure, they have a huge population, but they're taking, because of their authoritarian approach, they can afford to marshal resources and respond. Their people are complaining, in other words, dirty air in China. So they're getting pressure from their population, which is a good thing. It's not a democracy, but
I've read things that said we should be sending our experts to help them because we know how to do it.
I'm not quite sure that's, yeah, but it's a nice thought, sort of the Solar Peace Corps. Yes.
Great. You said maybe 25% of the homes in Massachusetts can support solar panels. Do you know what percentage we've got panels on?
Probably 1%. I mean, in other words, but tell me.
Plenty of room to grow.
Yes, there is. Lots of room to grow. And I think, again, this Senate bill tries to force the issue in as many ways as we can. We're going to subject electric power to every 5-year objectives looking toward net zero. Remember, the entire grid has to be green. So we're going to have to step up, no question, and get a lot more solar panels up. Some of them are going to be industrial scale, which means they are going to go into green spaces or at least open fields, not to woods. We're not going to tear down trees, but into what's farm. And a lot of farmers, by the way, feel that solar is a lifeline. They're having trouble surviving as farmers. They've got untilled fields that they want to use for solar, and we're starting to see this fight break out within the environmental community where some open space advocates are saying, no, put it on roofs only. I think that's, with all due respect to my friends in the environmental movement, an error.
You just
Yes.
mentioned not cutting down trees. Recently at the Wendell State Forest, there was a massive logging event, and they're all upset about that. And
They should
trying
be,
to
yeah.
get some legislation passed.
Yes.
Because if you're going to make the net zero and not absolute zero, you need
Right.
the negative emissions from trees. So
And there was so we've written that into, I hate to sound like a broken record, but advocates for Wendell and elsewhere were active on the Senate floor. We've written in provisions for measuring the sequestration potential of Massachusetts woods and forests and using that as a value in deciding where to site things. And so we are trying to give it prime real estate in terms of the set of ideas. I want to make, thank you, I just want to make sure, is there anyone else here that, yes, sir?
I do have a question. You talked about the socialization of the costs of using carbon-based fuels. And then you also talked about the net.
The net zero idea?
No, the revenue neutral idea.
Yes, yeah.
But that, as at least in the way you framed it or gave an example, didn't do anything to go and offset those social and health costs.
You're right. So this is a choice that, in a sense, we all have to engage in. That's a terrific point. You can raise money from carbon pricing, those additional charges on a gallon of gasoline, and you can spend them on mass transit. That would be a valid, or you can rebate it all. It's true. You have a choice of where to use the money. But here's the. Now I want you to talk to get in touch with your inner politician. We've had a tough time. There's only one state in the United States that's done carbon pricing for transportation and for buildings, and that's California. I've been working on carbon pricing since January of 2013. The first month I took office on behalf of Chelmsford and other places, and I've had a rough go of it. I've got it passed in the Senate, and now we need to sell it to the House. So I'm trying to say to the more conservative members of the House, if you're worried about the tax implications, if you don't want to raise money to address those those socialized costs, send it all back. That would protect you politically, and it would still drive down emissions, and it wouldn't then be a tax. It would be a refundable fee. I'm trying to be flexible because I am determined to get carbon pricing through the more conservative House. But you're right, it means giving up on carbon pricing as a revenue source, potentially. I would be happy with whatever the House chose to do, so go talk to them. What do you think?
Well, I would argue that paying those costs, the real costs, and remediating.
You mean using the money for some decent purpose? Is that what you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
that actually is in terms of the real cost.
Yeah.
Revenue neutral.
I love it. I love it. No, and I'm not being jocular.
Yeah.
You make an excellent point. I'm trying to make sure that it's.
I do understand.
To borrow the vernacular from some recent presidential debates, I don't want it to be my way or the highway. So I'm trying to, figure out a way to get to yes with my conservative colleagues, and they're very nervous about anything that smacks of a tax.
No, I understand.
Yeah, but your point is excellent.
However, you could say, I mean, I think you're right, but until we are actually willing to pay the extra tax, we are not going to get there.
Well, you can't have dirt cheap natural gas, fracked natural gas, and expect people to go for heat pumps, which are a significant upfront cost. So you're right. This current situation where polluting fossil fuels are at record lows could subvert everything else we might do. That's why carbon pricing is so important.
But at the same time, some of the legal structure around alternative energy. I have a south-facing roof.
Congratulations.
I want to put panels on it. I don't have a huge electric demand. I could have put more panels on than I could use. Net metering would not let me do that.
That's right.
And then the other side of that is, I'm talking to the company, and I said, okay, so this is essentially a generator sitting on my roof producing power. If the grid goes down in a storm or something, I want to be able to use that power. He said, oh, you can't. If the grid goes down, we shut down your generator.
Yeah.
And I said, this makes no sense. And yet that's the environment that, and you want me to put panels on the roof? And it's this? It's like, no, why would I?
Well, the solar business is very complicated, but consider my situation. I have solar panels too, and in my case, I don't own the panels. Most of us actually get the net metering credit on our monthly bills, which go down to zero, but the panels are actually owned by, an electric generating company, in my case, Sunrun, right? Sunrun doesn't own central electric utilities. It doesn't own an 800 megawatt plant running on natural gas that sits in one physical place and connects to the grid in that way. It owns, you might say, thousands of electric power plants. One of them sits on my roof. In the aggregate, they can be a major player in the electric power system, and yet they don't own a utility as we commonly recognize them at all. They own only distributed power. So they make their money by sitting on my roof. They give me a break to make it worth my while, but they sell it to the grid. So they want to be selling it to the grid. Just to, you would like to break away from the grid, and I get it, and we should make that more possible for you. Most of us are willing to be a part of the grid. Actually, my neighbors have electric or diesel generators as backup in case the grid goes down.
I'm perfectly willing to be connected, not only willing, but I want to be connected to the grid in case I have a peak demand, I can pull power.
Right.
But there are times when I would use considerably more power than I need, that under the normal situation, if I was working with somebody like
Good point.
they can buy power, so that's good. But again.
You could have a battery. Do you have a battery on site?
No.
A Tesla
No, but that's.
Powerwall?
You either put in a power wall or something, but you can't directly use
Right.
your solar array.
That's
to
true.
power your house,
Yeah.
unless you take it totally off the grid.
Good point. And we should tweak that. You're a rare case, but we should make it possible for you to do that. Congratulations.
But you can do that in New Hampshire,
Aha, that's good to know.
because there's folks who live back in the woods. They want their own power.
That's true. Yeah, they're off the grid. Yeah.
I just want to second that. I have a very large south-facing roof, and I maxed out the number of panels. I wanted to put more on, and the regulations around it make it so you can't.
Listen, there's no question the utilities weighed in to limit your potential to be your own entrepreneur, as it were. We have to get back at them, and but they had some clout 10 years ago when this all was fashioned.
Okay.
Yeah, I take your point.
So is it going to be readdressed?
It's not addressed in, and you're educating me right now. It's not addressed in the bill the Senate passed. Yes, hi.
I moved to Massachusetts in 2006.
Ah,
And
where'd you come from?
I remember soon after I'd been here, there was a move to get a wind farm out. Was it between Cape Cod and Martha's?
Right, yes, so that,
And Senator
right, Cape Wind.
was fighting it.
So that died, but the successors are over the horizon and they've been approved. The Trump people are holding them
It
up.
was like 10 years ago. What took so long to?
Well, we approved them, a major wind farm just over the horizon from the vineyard 2 years ago, and the Trump people have held it up. But it's huge, and it would provide a lot of, let's think on the positive side. It's huge, and it would generate a lot of electric power, but the Trump people are holding it up.
Well, what held it up for the 10 years before that?
The economics needed to shift, and for a while they were unfavorable. Cape Wind killed discussion for a while, you're right, because it seemed so discouraging.
So we shouldn't blame it on President Trump because.
No, we should blame it on, with all due respect, we should blame it on President Trump. We could have those windmills operating right now, not as quickly as we might have, but right now, were it not for his administration. So he is totally to blame on that one. It's hard to have a clear case of where someone is really responsible. He's really responsible.
So before that, nobody did anything, it doesn't matter.
You mentioned earlier tonight about trying to become carbon neutral with the use of trees, capture
Yeah.
wood pulp. And I've heard mixed things about that as a storage medium. It isn't as long-term as people might think. And I'm wondering, does any part of the legislation consider using soil carbon capture, farming and ranching techniques that can capture for hundreds of years carbon in soil? Is that in part of
Well,
the legislation?
no, that's an interesting area, but it's relatively new as a set of issues. We have something in the bill about anaerobic digestion, so we can use refuse from the farm, and including cow manure, to generate electricity, and that's given a special incentive under Massachusetts law. But no, we didn't. You're in a fascinating area, but it's new and evolving, and it was hard to get a handle on it and figure out how to incentivize it. But it's a good point.
We've actually been taking carbon out of Midwest soils and feeding them to cattle, feeding it to cattle in the form of corn. And those soils, those topsoil depths have gone down remarkably.
That's not a good
So
thing.
That's not a good thing. And I take the point that we should be talking about agricultural methods that start to put the carbon back into the soil.
You know, agriculture is subject to its separate limits. Agriculture in this state is like heavy manufacturing. It's not a big player. Our big players are your houses, business buildings, and transportation. So we have relatively little agriculture as a contributor to methane and to pollution, although farming practices in other places are big sources of emissions, and we have relatively little heavy manufacturing. So, but nevertheless, we do single out agriculture for its separate limits, and that I hope will encourage the kind of creative discussions you're talking about. Well, I think we've exhausted this topic for the evening. But listen, I wanted to thank you, and just to return to my major preoccupations, a lot of this has to happen at the federal level, even the international level. Some of it, very good portion, can happen at the state level. A lot can happen in Chelmsford, and I want to thank this town for already moving out front, and I hope it continues. So wonderful to be here. Thank you.